Chapter 6. For the first 2 weeks after Homer Wells had left Street Clouds, Wilbur Larch didn't answer the mail. Nurse Angela struggled with the longer sentences of Charles Dickens, and the boys listened to her every word, anticipating the errors. Mrs. Grogan suffered because of Melanie's interpretation of Charlotte Bronte. Near the end of chapter 27, Mrs. Grogan could detect Jane Eyre's spirit in Melanie's voice. "I care for myself, Melanie Reed. The more solitary, the more friendless I am, the more I will respect myself." "Please be a good girl," thought Mrs. Grogan. She told Dr. Larch that Melanie should be encouraged, she should be given more responsibility. Nurse Angela said she wanted to stop reading Dickens. Dr. Larch surprised them all. When Homer Wells had been gone for 3 weeks, Dr. Larch announced that he didn't care who read what to whom. He didn't care about the benediction, and so Nurse Edna had to continue the nightly salutation to the imagined princes of Maine, the dear little kings of New England. Melanie started reading Dickens to the boys. Her voice was too flat for Dickens. She made no mistakes, but she presented sunshine with the same heavy speech she used for gloom and fog. Mrs. Grogan, who accompanied Melanie and listened to her reading, saw that Melanie was searching through Dickens for specific characteristics of Homer Wells. The boys were terrified of Melanie, and their fears made them pay more attention to her than they had ever paid to Homer Wells. The little boys, lying frightened in their beds, felt that they were in Melanie's control. Nurse Edna suggested that nightmares in the boys' division were caused by Melanie's reading and that she should be removed from her responsibilities as reader. Nurse Angela disagreed. Mrs. Grogan was in favor of increasing Melanie's responsibilities. She felt that the girl was at the threshold of a change. She might either rise above her own bitterness or descend more deeply into it. Nurse Angela suggested to Dr. Larch that Melanie might be of use. "Of more use, you mean?" Dr. Larch asked. "Right," Nurse Angela said, but Dr. Larch didn't like it when the speech habits of Homer Wells were imitated. He gave Nurse Angela such a look that she never said right again. He also didn't want to teach Melanie. He didn't want her to replace Homer. "I don't have the patience to work with a teenager, anymore," Larch said peevishly. "I think Melanie is 24 or 25, Mrs. Grogan said. "How could someone of that age still be in an orphanage?" Larch wondered. "The same way that I can still be here," he answered himself. "All right. Let's ask her if she's interested," Larch said. He was afraid of the meeting with Melanie. He blamed her for Homer's rebellion. Larch knew he was unfair, and this made him feel guilty. He began to answer the mail. There was a long letter from Olive Worthington, and a check, a big donation to the orphanage. Mrs. Worthington said that her son had been delighted by the good work at Street Clouds and she was happy that he'd brought one of Dr. Larch's boys home with him. It was fine with the Worthingtons that Homer stay for the summer. Olive Worthington wanted Larch to know that she and her husband thought that Homer was a fine boy, polite and a good worker. She concluded that she hoped that Wally could even learn the value of a day's work from Homer. Olive also wrote that Homer had requested to be paid in the form of a monthly donation to Street Clouds. Since he shared a room with Wally and could fit into Wally's clothes, and since he ate his meals with the Worthington family, Olive said the boy's expenses were minimal. She was delighted that her son had such honorable company for the summer, and she was pleased to contribute to the comfort of the orphans of Street Clouds. Wally and Candy tell me you are doing great things there. They're so happy that they met you, wrote Olive. Wilbur Larch could inform Olive Worthington that she had a talented obstetrician caring for her apple trees, but he calmed himself and composed a warm, though formal, letter in response to Mrs. Worthington. Her donation was very gratefully received, and he was glad that Homer Wells was representing his upbringing at Street Clouds in such a positive manner. Also, that it would be nice if Homer would write. Dr. Larch was glad that there was a healthy summer job for Homer. They would miss the boy at Street Clouds, where he had always been of use, but Larch was happy for Homer. He congratulated Olive Worthington on the good manners and the generosity of her son. He said he would welcome Wally and Candy back at Street Clouds, anytime. Then Wilbur Larch wrote the most important part of the letter. There is one thing I must tell you about Homer Wells, Larch wrote. There is a problem with his heart, the doctor continued. He was more careful than he'd been when he discussed Homer's heart defect with Wally and Candy. His letter to Olive Worthington about Homer's heart was a kind of a warm-up exercise. He wanted Homer treated with kid gloves, as they say in Maine. Olive Worthington had mentioned that Homer was taking driving lessons from Wally and swimming lessons from Candy. The swimming lessons from that girl made Larch growl, and he concluded his advice about Homer's heart with the suggestion that Homer should take it easy with the swimming. Dr. Larch did not share Olive Worthington's opinion that every boy should know how to drive and swim. Dr. Larch could do neither. Here in Street Clouds, he wrote, to himself, it is necessary to have good obstetrical procedure. In other parts of the world, they learn how to drive and swim. He showed Olive Worthington's letter to Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, who both wept over it. They thought that Mrs. Worthington sounded charming and warm and intelligent, but Larch grumbled how it was strange that Mr. Worthington was so little in view. What was the matter with him? Why is his wife running the farm? Larch asked his nurses, who both scolded him for his readiness to assume there was something wrong when a woman was in charge of anything. they reminded him that he had an appointment with Melanie. Melanie prepared for her meeting with Dr. Larch. She was lying in her bed and reading over and over again the inscription she had written in the stolen copy of Little Dorrit, "To Homer Wells for the promise you made me, love, Melanie." Then she tried, again and again, to begin the book through her angry tears. She read, got lost, began again, got lost again. She grew angrier and angrier. Then she looked in her canvas bag of toilet articles and saw that the barrette, which Mary Agnes had stolen from Candy, and which Melanie had snatched out of Mary Agnes's hair and taken for herself, had been stolen again. She went to Mary Agnes Cork's bed and found the elegant barrette under Mary Agnes's pillow. Melanie's hair was cut too short for her to use the barrette. Besides, she was not exactly sure how to use it. So she put it into her jeans pocket. This was uncomfortable because her jeans were very tight. She went into the girls' shower room, where Mary Agnes Cork was washing her hair, and she turned the hot water up so hot that Mary Agnes was nearly scalded. Mary Agnes jumped out of the shower. She lay on the floor, where Melanie twisted her arm behind her back and then stepped with all her weight on Mary Agnes's shoulder. Melanie didn't mean to break anything, but she heard the sound of Mary Agnes's collarbone cracking. Melanie stepped quickly away from the younger girl, whose naked body turned from very red to very white. She lay on the shower room floor, not daring to move. "Get dressed and I'll take you to the hospital," Melanie said. "You broke something." Mary Agnes trembled. "I can't move," she whispered. "I didn't mean to," Melanie said, "but I told you not to touch my things." "Your hair's too short," Mary Agnes said. "You can't wear it, anyway." "Do you want me to break something else?" Melanie asked the girl. Mary Agnes tried to shake her head, but she stopped. "I can't move," she repeated. When Melanie bent over to help her up, Mary Agnes screamed, "Don't touch me." "Do what you want," Melanie said, leaving her there. "Just don't touch my things." In the lobby of the girls' division, on her way to her meeting with Dr. Larch, Melanie told Mrs. Grogan that Mary Agnes had broken something. Mrs. Grogan naturally assumed that Melanie meant that Mary Agnes had broken a lamp, or a window, or even a bed. "Do you like the book, dear?" Mrs. Grogan asked Melanie, who always carried Little Dorrit with her. She had read less than a page. "It starts slowly," said Melanie. When she got to Nurse Angela's office, where Dr. Larch was waiting for her, she was slightly out of breath and sweating. "What's the book?" Dr. Larch asked her. "Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens," Melanie said. She felt the barrette when she sat down. "Where did you get it?" Dr. Larch asked her. It was a gift, Melanie said. That's nice, said Wilbur Larch. Melanie shrugged. It starts slowly, she said. They looked at each other for a moment, cautiously. Larch smiled a little. Melanie tried to smile, but she was unsure how this looked on her face, so she stopped. She shifted in the chair, the barrette in her pocket hurt her. He's not coming back, is he? Melanie asked Dr. Larch. He felt respect for her because she had read his mind. He has a summer job, Larch said. Melanie shrugged. He might go to school, I suppose, she said. Oh, I hope so. Larch said. I suppose that you want him to be a doctor, Melanie said. Larch shrugged. It was his turn to show indifference. If he wants to be, he said. I broke someone's arm, once, Melanie said. Or maybe it was something in the chest. The chest? Larch asked. When did you do that? Not too long ago, Melanie said. Recently. I didn't mean to. How did it happen? Dr. Larch asked her. I twisted her arm behind her back, she was on the floor, and then I stepped on her shoulder. Ouch, said Dr. Larch. I heard the crack, Melanie said. It was her arm or her chest. Perhaps her collarbone, Larch suggested. Well, anyway, I heard it, Melanie said. How did that make you feel? Wilbur Larch asked Melanie, who shrugged. I don't know, Melanie said. Sick and strong, she added. Perhaps you'd like to have some more work to do? Larch asked her. Here? Melanie asked. Well, here, yes, Larch said. I could find more things for you to do here, more important things. Of course, I could also look for a job for you, outside, I mean. Away from here. So, you want me to go, or do more chores, is that it? I don't want you to do anything you don't want to do. You told me you didn't want to leave, once, and I'll never force you. I just think that you are looking for a change. You don't like how I read, huh? Melanie asked. Is that it? No. Dr. Larch said. I want you to keep reading, but that's only one of the things you could do here. Do you want me to do what Homer Wells did? Homer did a lot of studying, Dr. Larch said. Perhaps you could assist Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, and me. Perhaps you'd be interested in just observing, to see if you liked it. I think it's sick, Melanie said. Do you disapprove? Larch asked, but Melanie looked puzzled. What? She asked. You don't think that we should perform the abortions, right? Larch asked. You don't believe in terminating a birth, in aborting the fetus? Melanie shrugged. I just think it will make me sick, she repeated. Delivering babies is yucky, she said. And cutting babies out of people is yucky, too. Larch was confused. But don't you think it's wrong? He asked. What's wrong about it? She asked him. I think it's sick, Melanie said. It smells bad around here, she added, meaning the hospital air, the aura of ether, the scent of old blood. Wilbur Larch stared at Melanie and thought, she's just a big child, an aggressive baby. I don't want to work in the hospital, Melanie said flatly. I'll rake leaves, or do something like that, if you want me to work more, for my food. I want you to be happier than you are, Melanie, Dr. Larch said cautiously. He felt miserable to see such a lonely creature. Happier, said Melanie. She jumped in her chair and the stolen barrette dug into her. You're stupid, or crazy. Dr. Larch wasn't shocked, he nodded, considering the possibilities. He heard Mrs. Grogan calling him from the hall outside the dispensary. Dr. Larch. Dr. Larch. She called. Mary Agnes has broken her arm. Larch stared at Melanie, who smiled. You said this happened not too long ago? Larch asked her. I said recently, Melanie admitted. Larch went into the dispensary, where he examined Mary Agnes's collarbone, which was broken. Then he instructed Nurse Angela to prepare the child for X-ray. I slipped on the shower room floor, Mary Agnes moaned. It was really wet, Melanie. Dr. Larch called. Melanie was in the hall. Melanie, would you like to observe how we set a broken bone? Melanie walked into the dispensary, which was a small, crowded area, especially with Nurse Edna and Mrs. Grogan standing there, and with Nurse Angela leading Mary Agnes away for her X-ray. Seeing everyone together, Larch realized how old and weak he and his colleagues looked beside Melanie. Would you like to participate in the setting of a broken bone, Melanie? Larch asked the muscular young woman. No, Melanie said. I have got things to do. She waved the copy of Little Dorrit threateningly. And I have to look at what I'm going to read tonight, she added. She went back to the girls' division, to her window there, while Dr. Larch set Mary Agnes's collarbone. Melanie tried again to read and comprehend Little Dorrit. She daydreamed as she read, and so she missed the transition between the passages. Suddenly, she discovered she was reading about the prison. A prison taint was on everything. She read. Like a well, like a tomb, the prison had no knowledge of the brightness outside. She stopped reading. She left little Dorrit on her pillow. She took a pillowcase off a bed, and put into the pillowcase her canvas bag and some clothes. She also put there Jane Eyre. In Mrs. Grogan's room, Melanie found a purse. She robbed Mrs. Grogan of her money. There wasn't much, and also took Mrs. Grogan's heavy winter coat in the summer. The coat would be useful if she had to sleep on the ground. Mrs. Grogan was still at the hospital, worrying about Mary Agnes Cork's collarbone. Melanie wanted to say goodbye to Mrs. Grogan even after robbing her, but she knew the train timetable very well. At the train station, she bought a ticket only to Livermore Falls. She knew that even the stupid young station master would be able to remember that, and he would tell Dr. Larch and Mrs. Grogan that Melanie had gone to Livermore Falls. She also knew that on the train she could buy a ticket to some place much farther away than Livermore Falls. She wanted to find Homer. She remembered Ocean View Orchard's inscription on the Cadillac. That was on the coast, and the Cadillac had a Maine license plate. It didn't matter to Melanie that there were thousands of miles of coastline in the state of Maine. As her train started moving away from street clouds, Melanie said to herself, "I'm going to find you, Homer." Dr. Larch tried to comfort Mrs. Grogan. She was sorry that there was so little money in her purse for Melanie. "And my coat's not waterproof," Mrs. Grogan complained. "She should have a real raincoat in this state." Dr. Larch tried to reassure Mrs. Grogan. He said that Melanie was not a little girl. "She's 24 or 25, Larch reminded Mrs. Grogan. "I think her heart is broken," said Mrs. Grogan miserably. Dr. Larch said that Melanie had taken Jane Eyre with her. He thought that it was a hopeful sign. "She will not be without love, without faith. She had a good book with her." The book that Melanie had left behind was a puzzle to both Mrs. Grogan and Dr. Larch. They read the dedication to Homer Wells, which touched Mrs. Grogan deeply. In the absence of Melanie and Homer, Dr. Larch resumed his responsibilities as the nightly reader to both the boys and the girls' divisions. He attempted to read Little Dorrit to the girls. Chapter 3 had an unfortunate title for orphans, Home. He began the description of London on a Sunday evening. "Melancholy streets, in a penitential garb of soot," read Dr. Larch, and then he stopped. "We need no more melancholy here," he thought. "Shall we read Jane Eyre again?" Dr. Larch asked. The girls nodded readily. So Dr. Larch decided to write a letter to Olive Worthington. My dear Mrs. Worthington, here in Street Clouds, we depend on our few luxuries. If you would be so kind, please tell Homer that his friend Melanie has left us. We don't know where she is and that she took with her our only copy of Jane Eyre. The orphans in the girls' division liked listening to the story. In fact, Homer used to read to them. If Homer could find a replacement copy, the little girls and I would be happy. In other parts of the world, there are bookshops. Thus, Larch knew, he had done two things. Olive Worthington would send him a new book of Jane Eyre, and Homer would receive the important message about Melanie. Larch thought that Homer should know this. It was really difficult to read Little Dorrit. Even Candy, who replaced her stolen copy, never finished the book. Little Dorrit reminded her of her discomfort on the long journey to and from Street Clouds, and of what had happened to her there. She remembered the ride back to the coast. Candy was grateful for Homer's presence because she didn't have to talk to Wally. She couldn't even hear what Wally and Homer were saying to each other. She worried about how much she was bleeding. Between Street Clouds and the coast, she asked Wally 3 times to stop the car. She kept checking her bleeding and changing the pads. She looked at the back of Homer's head. If it's worse tomorrow, she thought, I'll have to ask him. When Wally went to the men's room and left them alone in the car, Homer spoke to her, but he didn't turn around. You're probably having cramps, he said. You're probably bleeding, but if the stains on the pad are only 2 or 3 inches in diameter, that's okay. It's expected. Thank you, Candy whispered. The bleeding should decrease tomorrow, and get much lighter the next day. If you're worried, you should ask me, he said. Okay, Candy said. She felt so strange, that a boy her own age should know so much about her. I've never seen a lobster, said Homer Wells, to change the subject. Then you've never eaten a lobster, either, Candy said cheerfully. I don't know if I want to eat something that I've never seen, Homer said, and Candy laughed. She was laughing when Wally got back in the car. We're talking about lobsters, Homer explained. Oh, they're very funny, Wally said, and all 3 of them laughed. Wait till you see one, Candy said to Homer. He's never seen a lobster, she told Wally. When they stopped laughing, Homer said, I've never seen the ocean, you know. Candy, did you hear that? Wally asked, but Candy was already asleep. You've never seen the ocean? Wally asked Homer. That's right, said Homer Wells. That's not funny, said Wally seriously. Right, Homer said, A little later, Wally said, "Do you want to drive for a while?" "I don't know how to drive," Homer said. "Really?" Wally asked. And later Wally asked, have you ever been with a girl, made love to one, you know?" But Homer Wells had already fallen asleep. "Candy?" Wally whispered. And a little later, he whispered, "Homer?" He liked the idea to be their guide through the night, and their protector. "Well, buddy," Wally said to the sleeping Homer Wells, "it's high time you had some fun." Almost a month later, Wilbur Large was still waiting to hear from Homer Wells. He was too proud to write the first letter. There in Street Clouds, Larch wondered about the fun Homer was having. Swimming lessons, he thought. What do they wear for swimming in a heated pool? How do they heat the pool, and how much do they heat it? In 194, the pool at the Haven Club was the first heated swimming pool in Maine. Raymond Kendall had invented the heating system for the Haven Club pool. It was just an exercise in mechanics for Ray. Homer liked Candy's father, perhaps because surgery is the mechanics of medicine. He made friends with the machinery with which Ray Kendall worked, both the apple farm equipment and the mechanisms for catching the lobsters. However, Homer didn't like the creatures. They crammed the tank in Ray Kendall's lobster pound, crawling over each other. Homer knew he had seen a good reason for learning how to swim. If he ever fell in the sea, he wouldn't want to fall to the bottom where these creatures lived. Homer pulled lobster pots with Candy's father on Sundays. He didn't do that for money, he just wanted to be around Ray. 6 days a week Homer worked with Wally in the orchards. The ocean was visible from only one of Ocean View's several orchards, but the presence of the sea was felt throughout the farm. Homer liked watching the seagulls that occasionally perched in the trees. Among orphans, thought Homer Wells, seagulls are better than crows because seagulls possess freedom. So it occurred to Homer Wells that he was free. Wilbur Larch knew that freedom was an orphan's most dangerous illusion. When he finally received a letter from Homer, he was disappointed because of its lack of detail. But as for illusions, and all the rest, there was simply no evidence. "I am learning to swim," wrote Homer Wells. "I know. I know. Tell me about it," thought Wilbur Larch. "I am better at driving," Homer added. "Mrs. Worthy-Rigdon is very nice. She knows everything about apples. Candy's father is very nice, too," Homer Wells wrote to Dr. Larch. "He takes me out on his lobster boat, and he is teaching me how an engine works." "Do you wear a life jacket on the lobster boat?" Wilbur Larch wanted to know. Do you think an engine is so special? I could teach you how the heart works, thought Wilbur Larch. Candy and Wally are wonderful. Homer wrote. I go everywhere with them. I sleep in Wally's room. I wear his clothes. It's great that we're the same size, although he is stronger. Candy and Wally are getting married one day, and they want to have lots of children. Tell me about the swimming lessons, thought Wilbur Larch. Poor Mr. Worthington, everyone calls him Senior, Homer wrote. Ah, thought Wilbur Larch. So something isn't perfect, is it? What's poor about Mr. Worthington? He asked Nurse Angela, and Nurse Edna what they thought of the name Senior. They agreed that the name was strange. It sounds stupid to me, said Wilbur Larch. Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna told him he wasn't fair. They agreed that Homer's letter was late, but they said that this showed only how happy and how busy he was. You want him to be a doctor, Wilbur, Nurse Edna said, but it's his life. Do you expect him to be a writer, too? Nurse Angela said. And never get married? Nurse Edna asked dangerously. I expect him to be of use, thought Wilbur Larch tiredly. And I want him to be here, with me. He knew that his last wish was unfair. In the dispensary, he rested from the summer heat. The ether fumes evaporated more slowly in the humidity. He was traveling both farther away and for longer in his ether dreams now. When he came out of the ether, he did it more slowly. I'm getting older, he repeated to himself. A beautiful and untouched copy of Jane Eyre arrived from Mrs. Worthington, and Wilbur Larch read more excitedly to the girls. Correspondence slowly developed between Wilbur Larch and Homer Wells. Homer wrote about the facts of his life in Hart's Rock and Hart's Haven. He sent Dr. Larch a page, maybe 2 pages once a week or every other week. To his letters Dr. Larch responded with questions. What exactly is the matter with Mr. Worthington? And a flood of details about the daily life of street clouds. Dr. Larch provided Homer Wells with a calendar of hospital and social events. His letters to Homer Wells were longer than his longest passages in A Brief History of Street Clouds, and they were written and mailed the day after Dr. Larch had received a few lines from Homer. You can't expect the boy to compete with you, Nurse Angela said. What is wrong with this Senior Worthington character? Dr. Larch asked. Homer said it was a drinking problem, Wilbur, Nurse Edna reminded him, but what Wilbur Larch expected from his young apprentice was clinical analysis, the exact definition of characteristics associated with light, medium, or heavy drinking. Are we talking about a guy who makes a fool out of himself at parties? Wilbur Larch wondered. Or is this something chronic? Because Homer Wells had never seen a drunk before, he was easily deceived by Senior Worthington's appearance, and Homer was ready to accept Senior's degradation as the natural result of alcoholism. Senior became short-tempered, irritable, and sometimes even aggressive. Senior made terrible mistakes in any complex motor task. While cleaning the carburetor for the Cadillac, a simple job, which Ray Kendall had demonstrated for him many times, Senior inhaled the gas in the tubes he sucked in instead of blowing out. Senior had all the other symptoms, too. He was 55, he looked 70. He had periods of paranoia, of confabulation. Senior's recent memory was so impaired that he wandered for an hour through his own bedroom unable to dress himself. Yet his long-range memory was quite intact. He sang college songs to Olive, he told Wally stories of Wally as a baby. Sometimes Senior didn't drink for 3 days, and he observed that his silliness flourished, anyway. Homer Wells wanted that summer to last forever. His life at Ocean View made him happy. He loved the Worthingtons' carpets. At Street Clouds there were just bare wood walls and many layers of linoleum. Homer had not seen pictures on walls before. Homer even admired the oil painting of the cat in the flower bed in Wally's bathroom, and he liked the wallpaper with flowers, too. What did he know about wallpaper or art? He thought that all wallpaper was wonderful. He loved all his fellow workers. He loved Meanie Hyde the most, because Meanie was so friendly and had such a fondness for explaining how everything was done. At Street Clouds, growth was unwanted and the process of birth was often interrupted. Now he was engaged in the business of growing things. What he loved about the life at Ocean View was how everything was of use and that everything was wanted. Homer often imagined that Candy was sleeping beside him, and they were holding tightly each other in a grip of innocent affection. Candy smoked, but she was so mannered that she often dropped her cigarette in her lap, jumping up and furiously brushing away the sparks, always laughing. "Oh, how clumsy I am!" she cried. If so, thought Homer Wells, only when you're smoking. In all of Hart's Rock and Hart's Haven, there was nothing that reminded Homer of Street Clouds, nothing until the first rainy day, when they sent him, with a small crew of scrubbers and painters, to the cider house. It was a long, thin, one-story, shed-roofed building in the shape of an arm held at a right angle, in the elbow of the building, where there was a double-door entrance, were the cider mill and the press. One wing of the building was occupied with refrigeration units, it was a cold storage room for the cider. In the other wing, there was a small kitchen, beyond which you could see 2 long rows of ironed hospital-style beds, each with its own blanket and pillow. Mattresses were rolled neatly on each of the more than 20 beds. Sometimes a blanket hanging on wire runners separated a bed, or a section of beds, which Homer Wells associated with a hospital ward. Unpainted shelves between the beds formed primitive wardrobe closets, which contained reading lamps wherever there was an electrical outlet. The furniture was shabby but neat. "What is this place?" Homer asked Meanie Hyde. "It's the cider house," said Meanie. "But who sleeps here, who stays here? Do people live here?" Homer asked. It was remarkably clean, yet the atmosphere reminded Homer of street clouds. "It's for the pickers," Meanie Hyde said. "During the harvest, the pickers stay here, the migrants." "It's for the colored folks," said Big Dot Taft. "Every year, we make it nice for them. We wash everything and we give everything a fresh coat of paint." "Negroes?" Homer Wells asked. "Are the pickers Negroes?" "Some of them are as black as night," said Florence Hyde. "They're okay. They're nice," added Meanie Hyde. "Some of them are nicer than others," said Big Dot Taft. "They are like other people that I know," Irene Titcomb said, giggling. "They're nice because Mrs. Worthington is nice to them," Meanie Hyde said. Deborah Pettigrew smiled at Homer over the bucket they were scrubbing together. He cautiously smiled back while asking where Wally was working today, in the rain. The building smelled like vinegar, old cider that had turned. It was a strong smell, but there was nothing stifling or unclean about it. That night Homer had his first date with Deborah Pettigrew, then they went to the drive-in movie with Candy and Wally. They all went in Senior's Cadillac. Homer and Deborah Pettigrew sat in the back seat. Homer didn't know that the purpose of drive-in movies was to make love in the back seats of cars. "Homer's never been to a drive-in before," Wally announced to Deborah Pettigrew. "I've never been to a movie before," Homer admitted. "Gosh," said Deborah Pettigrew. She smelled nice. She was much neater and cleaner than she looked in her work clothes. She was nice looking, relaxed, friendly, hard-working and not very smart. She was going to marry someone pleasant and not much older or smarter than she was. The drive-in movie in Cape Kenneth was new to Maine. It was amazing, this whole experience, for Homer Wells. What he was most unprepared for was the movie itself. The camera backed, or rather, lurched away. He saw something's head, a kind of horse. Thought Homer Wells. It was a camel, actually, but Homer Wells had never seen a camel, or a picture of one. He thought it was a horribly deformed horse, a mutant horse. On the camel, there was a black-skinned man in white wrapping, bandages, thought Homer Wells. Suddenly, music. Homer jumped. Words. The titles, the names of the actors were written in the sand by an invisible hand. What was that? Homer asked Wally. He meant the animal, its rider, the desert, the credits, everything. Some dumb Bedouin, I think, Wally said. A Bedouin? Thought Homer Wells. Is it a kind of horse? He asked. What horse? Asked Deborah Pettigrew. The animal, Homer said. Candy turned around in the front seat and looked at Homer with heartbreaking affection. That's a camel, Homer, she said. You've never seen a camel? Wally shouted. Well, where could he see a camel? Candy said to him. I was just surprised, Wally said defensively. I've never seen a Negro, either, Homer said. That was one, on the camel. A Negro Bedouin, I guess, Wally said. Gosh, said Deborah Pettigrew, who looked at Homer a little fearfully. Then the credits were over. The black man on the camel was gone, the desert was also gone. It was a pirate movie. Great ships were blasting each other with cannons, some bad men with uncut hair and baggy pants were doing terrible things to nicer looking men, who were better dressed. None of the men was black. Perhaps the camel's rider had been a kind of omen, thought Homer Wells. His experience of stories by Charles Dickens and Charlotte Bronte hadn't prepared him for characters who came from and traveled nowhere, or for stories that made no sense. The pirates stole a lot of coins and a blonde woman from another ship before they sank the ship and sailed away in their own vessel, on which they drank and sang. They enjoyed teasing the woman, but some mysterious force kept them from actually harming her, for a whole hour, during which they harmed nearly everyone else and many of themselves. The woman, however, was reserved for more teasing. Homer was only partially aware that Wally and Candy weren't interested in the movie. Twice Homer heard her say, "No, Wally," once with a firmness he had never heard in her voice before. Wally's frequent laughter continued at intervals, and he whispered and murmured. When Homer looked at Deborah, he was surprised to find her looking at him. Not critically but not very affectionately either. She looked really amazed. Once she touched his hand, he thought she wanted something, and turned to her politely. She just stared at him, he looked back at the movie. I think I've missed something, Homer Wells announced after more than an hour had passed. Candy sat up in the front seat and looked at him with great concern. When the movie was over, he realized he was crying, He realized that although he loved the place where he was, he loved Dr. Larch more than anyone else. At this point in his life, he still loved Larch more than he loved Candy, and he realized that he missed Larch, too, but at the same time he hoped he would never again set foot in Street Clouds. Deborah Pettigrew thought the movie had moved Homer to tears. There, she said in a mothering tone, hugging him. Candy and Wally leaned over the front seat. Candy touched his head. "It's okay. You can cry." "I cry at lots of movies," she said. "You dear boy," Candy thought, "please don't forget about your heart." She put her cheek against Homer's cheek and kissed him near his ear. It was a very sudden surprise to her, how much she enjoyed that kiss of friendship. It surprised Homer Wells, too. It was a feeling that rushed him from nowhere, and he knew, looking at Wally's fond and handsome face, that it was a feeling with nowhere to go. Was that love? So love came to him, leaving him no options for its use. Homer wrote Dr. Larch a long letter, his longest so far. He tried to tell Larch about the drive-in movie, but the letter degenerated into a critique of the movie itself, and so he tried to change the subject. Should he tell Larch that he had learned the real purpose of the drive-in? Should he tell Dr. Larch how he imagined he was falling in love, or already had fallen in love, with Candy, which he knew was forbidden? And how could he say, "I miss you," when he didn't want to come back? And so he ended the letter vaguely. "I remember when you kissed me," he wrote to Dr. Larch. "I wasn't really asleep." "Yes," thought Dr. Larch, "I remember that, too." He rested in the dispensary. Why didn't I kiss him more? Why not all the time? He asked himself. In other parts of the world, he dreamed, they have drive-in movies. Dr. Larch always used more ether than he should have before the annual meeting of Street Clouds Board of Trustees. He'd never quite understood what a Board of Trustees was for, and his impatience with the routine inquiries was growing. In the old days, there'd been the Maine State Board of Medical Examiners. They'd never asked him any questions. This year there were 2 new board members who'd never before seen the orphanage, and so the meeting had been scheduled to take place in Street Clouds. The board usually met in Portland. The new members wanted to see the place. It was a perfect August morning, but Larch was irritable. "I don't know exactly what a drive-in movie is," he said crossly to Nurse Angela. "Homer doesn't say exactly." Nurse Angela looked frustrated. "No, he doesn't," she agreed, reading the letter again and again. "What do you do with your cars when you're watching the movie?" Nurse Edna asked. "I don't know," Dr. Larch said. I assume that if you drive into something to see the movie, you must stay in your cars. But what do you drive into, Wilbur? Nurse Edna asked. That's what I don't know. Larch shouted. Well, aren't we in a lovely mood? Nurse Angela said. Why would you want to bring your car to a movie in the first place? Nurse Edna asked. I don't know the answer to that, either, Dr. Larch said tiredly. Unfortunately, he looked tired during the trustees' meeting, too. The two new members seemed in an awful hurry to demonstrate that they already understood everything, and Dr. Larch was really angry. The new woman on the board, Mrs. Goodall, had been appointed for her abilities at fundraising. She was especially aggressive. She coldly expressed her respect for how much experience Larch and his assistants had with administering street clouds. Perhaps they all could be invigorated by a younger assistant. You need a young intern with some new ideas in the obstetrical field, Mrs. Goodall suggested. I keep up with the field, Dr. Larch said. And I keep up with the number of babies born here. Well, then, how about a new administrative assistant? Mrs. Goodall suggested. I'm talking about someone who could handle the correspondence and the interviewing for you. I could use a new typewriter, Dr. Larch said. Just get me a new typewriter. The new man on the board was a psychiatrist. He was rather new at psychiatry, which was rather new in Maine in 194. His name was Gingrich. The older members of the board, all men, all as elderly as Larch, were intimidated by this new man who spoke in whispers and by this new woman who was so loud. In tandem, they seemed so sure of themselves. Oh dear, Nurse Edna thought. She knew that Wilbur Larch was protecting his ability to perform the abortions. How could he accept a new assistant without knowing the person's beliefs? Now, Dr. Larch, Dr. Gingrich said softly, someone with all your responsibilities should have all the help he can get. Someone with my responsibility should stay responsible, Larch said. With the pressure you must be under, said Dr. Gingrich, it's no wonder you find it hard to delegate even a little of that responsibility. I have more use for a typewriter than for a delegate, Wilbur Larch said. Let's see, Mrs. Goodall said sharply. You're in your 70s, now. Is that correct? Aren't you 70-something? She asked Dr. Larch. Right, said Wilbur Larch. 70-something. And how old is Mrs. Grogan? Mrs. Goodall asked suddenly. I'm 62. Mrs. Grogan said bravely, and I'm as lively as a spring chicken. Oh, no one doubts you're not lively, said Dr. Gingrich. And Nurse Angela? Mrs. Goodall asked, not looking up at anyone. I'm 58, Nurse Angela said. Angela is as strong as an ox, Mrs. Grogan said. We don't doubt it, said Dr. Gingrich cheerfully. I'm 55 or 56, Nurse Edna said, before the question was raised. You don't know how old you are? Dr. Gingrich asked meaningfully. Actually, said Wilbur Large, we're all so senile, we can't remember, we're just guessing. But look at you, he said suddenly to Mrs. Goodall. She raised her eyes from her pad. I guess you have such trouble remembering things, Large said, that you have to write everything down. I'm just trying to get the picture of what's going on here, Mrs. Goodall said evenly. Well, Large said. Listen to me, then. I've been here long enough to have the clear picture in mind. It's very clear what a wonderful job you're doing, Dr. Gingrich told Dr. Larch. It's also clear how hard the job is. Larch realized that someone would replace him soon. He looked at his calendar. He had 2 abortions to perform the next day, and 3 more at the end of the week. And what if they get someone who won't perform an abortion? He thought. But then, just in time, the new typewriter arrived, and it fitted into his plans for Fuzzy Stone. Thank you for the new typewriter, Larch wrote to the Board of Trustees. It had arrived just in time, he added, because the old typewriter had completely broken down. This was not true. He replaced the keys on the old typewriter, and it now typed differently. And it typed letters from young Fuzzy Stone. Fuzzy wrote to Dr. Larch that he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. I doubt that I will ever feel about abortion like you, young Fuzzy wrote to Dr. Larch. Certainly, it is obstetrics that interests me, and certainly your example is responsible for my interest, but I expect we shall never agree about abortion. And so on. The correspondence between Dr. Larch and Fuzzy Stone covered many years. Larch wrote into the future. He completed Dr. F. Stone's training. He put him through medical school. And always Fuzzy Stone remained faithful to his beliefs. I'm sorry, but I believe there is a soul, and that it exists from the start, Fuzzy Stone wrote. Later young Dr. Stone proposed that he should replace Dr. Larch, but not until you're ready to retire, of course. He wanted to demonstrate to Dr. Larch that the law should be observed, that abortions should not be performed, and that a safe and informative view of family planning, birth control, and so forth could in time achieve the desired effect. Without breaking the laws of God or man, wrote Fuzzy Stone. It exhausted Larch, but he put it all down, one typewriter for Fuzzy that was used for nothing else, and the new one for himself. He imagined that their correspondence ended, quite abruptly, when Large refused to accept the idea that anyone should replace him who was unwilling to perform abortions. "I will go until I drop," he wrote to Fuzzy. "Here in Street Clouds, I will never allow myself to be replaced by some reactionary religious fanatic. I am sorry you're a doctor." Large ranted to poor Fuzzy. "You are not the proper doctor for this orphanage, and you will get my job over my dead body." What he heard from Dr. Stone, after that, was a rather curt note in which Fuzzy said he needed to search his soul regarding his personal debt to Dr. Larch and his perhaps larger debt to society, and to all the murdered unborn of the future. It was hard, Fuzzy meant, to listen to his conscience and not turn in Dr. Larch to the authorities, he added threateningly. "What a good story," thought Wilbur Larch. It had taken him the rest of August of 194. He wanted to complete the thing when Homer Wells returned to Street Clouds from his summer job. So Wilbur Larch had created a replacement for himself. He had created someone with qualified obstetrical procedure, and, what could be better, an orphan familiar with the place from birth. He had also created a perfect lie, because the Dr. F. Stone whom Wilbur Larch had in mind would perform abortions, of course. At the same time, what could be better? He would have the reputation of a doctor who was against abortions. When Larch retired, he would already have available his most perfect replacement. Wilbur Larch lay in the dispensary. "There's only one problem," he thought, dreaming. "How can I persuade Homer to play the part?" That night Homer Wells, gazing at the stars of Main Owlie's window, remembered how he had yelled his echoless good night to Fuzzy Stone. Homer was listening to Wally's peaceful breathing. "The problem is," Homer Wells thought, "I am in love with Candy." And Candy suggested that he should not go back to Street Clouds. "My father likes you so much," she'd told Homer. "I know he'll give you a job on the boat, or in the pound." "My mother likes you so much," Wally had added. "I know she'll give you a job in the orchards. And she gets lonely every time I go back to college. She will be happy if you stay in my room." How can I not be in love with Candy? Homer wondered. And if I stay here, he asked himself, what can I do? And what can I do if I go back to Street Clouds?